Unless you've been living under a rock, in the last few years, you've probably heard or read about the harms of not getting enough sleep. And the effects of insufficient sleep on health are relatively easy to study compared with subjects such as mistimed sleep and poor quality sleep. So we know quite a lot about what goes wrong when people don't sleep enough. Cross-sectional studies are one way of looking at the effects of insufficient sleep. And these types of studies associate short sleep with seemingly every chronic disease out there. To give you an idea of this, there was a meta-analysis in 2017 of 150 prospective studies where people are tracked over time, and this included a total of over 5.1 million people. It found that short sleep was associated with a 12% increased risk of death in subsequent years, a 37% increased risk of developing diabetes, a 17% increased risk of developing high blood pressure, a 26% increased risk of developing coronary heart disease, and a 38% higher risk of going on to develop obesity. And some of these studies look at whether there is a dose-response relationship, and they often find that there is one. For example, perhaps 5 hours is worse than 6 hours, which is worse than 7 hours. But there are some obvious limitations to these types of studies. For example, short sleep is defined differently between studies. Many define it as less than 5 hours per night, but some make the cut point at less than 6 hours. Most of these studies are based on self-reported sleep, meaning they just ask people how long they sleep, which isn't necessarily accurate. And these studies look at population averages. So while in many of these studies of adults, the group with the lowest risk are those reporting roughly 7 hours of sleep per night, that doesn't mean that 7 hours is best for you all the time as well. Cross-sectional studies associate long sleep with poor health too, but I think it's wrong to interpret this as implying that at the level of the individual, sleeping more is likely to cause worse health. And I think instead the relationships between long sleep and in health probably reflect at least two things. One of these is so-called reverse causality, meaning that poor health causes long sleep as opposed to vice versa. And it makes sense that some health problems would prolong sleep, which is a bodily state that supports restoration. I think also people conflate sleep with time in bed. Some studies use quite crude questions about sleep that are easy to misinterpret. Moving on from these types of studies, to show causal relationships between sleep duration and health, scientists use experiments in which they change the duration of the sleep opportunity or time in bed. There are a few of these types of experiments. One is a sleep deprivation experiment where somebody is allowed no sleep whatsoever. And as you can imagine, these are really hard on the participants. And they also lack ecological validity because in the real world, it's rare that somebody has to go entirely without sleep with no opportunities for even a brief catnap. There are sleep restriction studies too, which are more ecologically valid, and these permit some sleep, but not as much sleep as somebody actually needs. And then there are sleep extension studies, and these actually give people more time in bed than they habitually have, perhaps letting them catch up on lost sleep. And then another type of study looks at catch-up sleep specifically. For example, it's common for these studies to have a protocol that includes 5 consecutive days of sleep restriction, which mimics the nights before work days, and then 2 nights of sleep extension, which for most people mimics Friday night and Saturday night, respectively. And all of these experimental approaches have shed light on the importance of sleep duration across different timescales. Since many people nowadays seemingly want to look young until the grave, and most of us are trying to look better naked, I thought I'd highlight some examples of these types of experiments that focus specifically on body composition and facial attractiveness. I could equally have picked experiments showing that sleep loss tends to produce a host of negative effects, such as impairing attention, memory, decision making, worsening mood, reducing exercise capacity, blunting antibody responses to vaccinations, and more. But let's instead focus on vanity for now. Starting with the effects of insufficient sleep on food intake and metabolism, Serum and Rutrikul published a meta-analysis on the effects of insufficient sleep on appetite and food intake and some aspects of metabolism 5 years ago. And this group of scientists found that looking at all short-term experimental studies, sleep restriction tended to increase hunger and daily calorie intake by roughly 250 calories per day compared with normal sleep. That's about the amount of energy that's in a Snickers bar. Related to this, short-term sleep restriction led people to gain about a third of a kilogram and reduced insulin sensitivity, which means that the tissues of these people weren't responding as well to the effects of insulin. Insulin wasn't shuttling nutrients into the tissues as effectively, increasing the amount of insulin that the pancreas had to produce. And so were these effects to continue over time, as one would expect, it's likely that these people will gain a substantial amount of body fat. But moving on to the effects of insufficient sleep on facial attractiveness, one of my favorite studies on the subject is a 2017 paper by John Axelson and his colleagues. They photographed healthy young adults after 2 days of normal sleep or after 2 days of 4 hours less time in bed than usual. And they had people rate participants' attractiveness, as well as how healthy they looked, how sleepy they looked, and how trustworthy they appeared. The people who rated the individuals reported being less likely to socialize with the sleep-deprived people, and after sleep loss, participants were perceived as being less attractive, as well as less healthy and more sleepy. So maybe there really is something to the idea of beauty sleep, but I don't want to dwell on the negative effects of insufficient sleep, and instead want to point to the corollary of this, which is that if you don't regularly get enough sleep, getting more sleep can improve your food choices, your body composition, and most likely your attractiveness too. As a nice demonstration of this, Ezra Tassali and her colleagues from the University of Chicago published a great study a couple of years ago where they took overweight young adults who slept less than 6.5 hours per night, and they split them into a control condition or a sleep extension group. And the people in the sleep extension group aimed to get at least 8.5 hours time in bed each night, and they took a personalized approach to this. The groups were followed for 2 weeks after 2 weeks of baseline sleep assessment. What they found is that the sleep extension group increased their sleep duration by roughly an hour and 12 minutes each night and maintained their sleep efficiency, which is an important marker of sleep quality. But whereas the control group actually increased their energy intake slightly by about 115 calories per day, as well as their body weight by about 0.4 kilograms, the sleep extension group reduced both. They consume roughly 160 fewer calories each day, and they lost about half a kilogram, such that at the end of the 2 weeks, the difference in energy intake between the groups was about 270 calories per day. And they didn't find any effects on total daily energy expenditure, hence the difference in weight between the group, which was surely driven by changes in food intake. They did another analysis which showed that the change in sleep seemed to negatively associate with the change in weight, by which I mean each 1 hour increase in sleep duration was associated with a 160 calorie per day reduction in energy intake. So it might be that sleep duration was causally affecting their food intake. I also want to comment briefly on catch-up sleep here. In the first episode in this series, and if you missed it, then I've linked to it in the show notes below, I mentioned the importance of the regularity of sleep. Regular sleep times are certainly key, but what about if you don't get enough sleep on nights before work days? And then when you get the chance to sleep in before work-free days, you take the opportunity. After all, many of us do this. When you think about it, this pattern is basically intermittent sleep extension amidst chronic insufficient sleep or sleep restriction. Looking across several cross-sectional studies on the subject, findings tend to show that catch-up sleep is associated with better health than just having insufficient sleep day in, day out. And these studies have looked at things like cardiometabolic health and health-related quality of life. And this jives with what you might expect of other pillars of lifestyle. Just to give a couple of examples here. Regarding exercise, there is research showing that weekend warriors who only train on the weekends are likely to have better health than people who are permanently sedentary. In the case of nutrition, you might have heard of the 5-2 diet, which involves 2 days of very low energy intakes each week, and then 5 days of minimal or no restriction. And it's clear that this type of approach can lead to weight loss and other beneficial health outcomes. Returning to catch-up sleep, counterintuitively, some of the initial experiments on this subject have actually shown that catch-up sleep might not be better than sleep restriction day in and day out, and might even in some ways be marginally worse. This is a subject that needs more attention at another time, but I think we need to consider carefully what the totality of effects of continued sleep loss versus catch-up sleep might be. And my intuition is that catch-up sleep is almost always a good idea still. Moving on, I want to briefly discuss how prevalent short sleep is. For I think there's been some confusion about this subject in recent years. Some of this confusion rippled out of the waves of a popular book, and to give credit to the author of said book, he's since changed his tune and said that he got carried away when discussing the societal prevalence and burden of sleep loss. So kudos to him. There are different ways of looking at sleep duration within a population. We can look, for example, at the prevalence of people sleeping below a predetermined threshold. And this is often what is done in population survey. For example, the latest CDC data from 2020 found that 35% of US adults get less than 7 hours of sleep per night. But as we'll return to, some people probably actually need less than 7 hours per night, even if these individuals are in the minority. And this prevalence of sleep below, say, 7 hours, of course, varies by country, just using the US as one example. We can also look at data from wearables and other types of sleep tracking technology, for these are so widely used nowadays. Advantages of these wearables are that they continuously measure sleep day in and day out, and they use more objective metrics than questionnaires. Choosing one particular wearable, the Aura Ring, Michael Chi from the National University of Singapore published some work last year in which he looked at 220,000 Aura Ring users over an average of 35 weeks per person. And his analysis included people from various countries. When he split people by geographic locations, he found that in Asia, weekday sleep averaged 6.5 hours, which was less than elsewhere where the average was 7 hours. He also found that weekday sleep in Asia was later and more variable. And then weekend sleep extension was longer in Europe than Asia. So this highlights the fact that people sleep quite differently in different parts of the world. But there are some patterns that seem to be quite consistent from country to country, including the fact that most of us sleep a bit more before work-free days than we do before work days. Another way of looking at insufficient sleep is by looking at use of alarm clocks to wake people up in the morning. One of the better analyses of this subject is a 2012 analysis of the Munich Chronotype questionnaire database. And in that analysis, Till Roneberg and his colleagues found that roughly 80% of the tens of thousands of regularly working people in the database frequently wake to alarm clocks. So that suggests that most people are getting less sleep than they would be able to get. And then for now, the final way of looking at whether people don't get enough sleep that I'll mention is experimentally looking at people's sleep capacity. There was a terrific demonstration of the fact that lots of us aren't getting enough sleep by Elizabeth Clerman and her colleagues that came out a few years ago. It doesn't tell us anything about the population at large, but it does indicate that some of us can sleep much more than we currently do on a nightly basis. And in this study, they let healthy young adults sleep as much as they could for up to 4 weeks. And they used the gold standard way of measuring sleep, namely polysomnography, a testament to their sleep debt. At first, the people in this experiment slept about 11 hours per night on average. But over the course of the days and the weeks, their sleep shortened. And at the end of roughly a week, it reached a steady state plateau of just over 8.5 hours of actual sleep per night. Obviously, most of us couldn't do something like this, but it's a great way of identifying sleep needs. And the closest that many of us could get to this type of experiment is probably when not working and able to self-select bedtimes, for example, way to go and live on an island on holiday and just rest as much as you craved. So it seems likely that lots of people aren't getting enough sleep, which probably jives with your experience if you've ever used public transport and found that many passengers are fast asleep within minutes of boarding the bus, train, or plane. But one of the questions that follows is whether things are moving in the right direction. Are people now getting more sleep than they used to? Some have suggested that countries such as North America are in a sleep loss epidemic, but to me, this seems unfounded. And zooming in on the US specifically, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, the Sleep Research Society, and the CDC initiated the National Healthy Sleep Awareness Project in 2013 with the goal of improving public health by promoting adequate sleep. Off the back of this, David Dinges from the University of Pennsylvania published a fascinating analysis in 2018. In it, he used the American Time Use Survey data, which are representative of Americans aged 15 years and older. And this survey has been completed annually since 2003. The participants report what they're doing on a minute-by-minute basis during a 24-hour period. And in this analysis, Dinges and his colleagues looked at data from 2003 to 2016. And within this, there were over 180,000 respondents. They found that sleep duration actually increased over time. It increased by about 1 minute and 24 seconds per 24 hours per year on weekdays, and by about 50 seconds per 24 hours per year on weekends. And that difference translates to over 83 hours or 3.5 days more sleep per year just on weekdays. When they stratified people, they found that this was true whether people were short sleepers, so people sleeping 7 hours or less per night, long sleepers, those reporting over 9 hours of sleep per night. But there was no change in the percentage of people who reported sleeping over 7 hours, but less than 9 hours per night. So it was the short sleepers and the long sleepers who were sleeping more over time. And they found that sleep duration increased across survey years in many different groups of people, including employed individuals, people who are retired, full-time students. They also looked at various sleep relevant behaviors and how much time people were spending on those. And they found that given that there were increasing opportunities to do tasks from home, such as work, learning, banking, shopping, and life admin tasks, people had more free time. And some of that was used to spend more time in bed. Obviously, this type of study has its shortcomings, though. It's not like they were looking at objective measures of sleep duration. For the most part, when people use single question items to assess sleep, they tend to slightly overestimate sleep duration. Related to this, the time use data exceeded NHANES data from the same period by about an hour on average. But the point is that when you look at the time use survey data, it's been a consistent question across years. And so the trend in sleep duration probably does mean something. One of the reasons that I pointed out that it's not as if everybody is sleeping less nowadays is that your perception of the adequacy of your sleep duration is probably actually really important. This hasn't been well studied, but my favorite example of this is a study that's published by Stephen Lockley's group in 2020. In this, the scientists manipulated people's perceptions of how much sleep they got, and they then measured next day brain function. So going into the details of the experiment, healthy young adults had an 8-hour sleep opportunity, followed by a 5-hour sleep opportunity on 2 consecutive nights. They were randomized to being informed that they had had either an 8-hour or a 5-hour sleep opportunity. And this was done via an alarm clock that either ran fast, slow, or normally. And they studied brain function in several ways. These included a widely used version of the psychomotor vigilance test and subjective sleepiness ratings. They also used electrodes on the scalp to measure brain waves associated with the brain's hunger for sleep and the body clock driven wake drive that I've mentioned on previous episodes. They found that people's perceptions of their sleep duration affected their brain function in several ways. Specifically, their reaction times were faster when the people thought they'd slept 8 hours but were given a 5-hour sleep opportunity, whereas their reaction times were slower when people thought they had 5 hours of sleep but were given an 8-hour sleep opportunity. And these effects were surely related to electrical activity in the brain, as you would expect. EEG delta power, which is the measure of the brain's hunger for sleep that they looked at, was higher during wakefulness when sleep was restricted to 5 hours, and people thought they'd slept 5 hours. But that increase in these brainwaves was lower when people thought they'd had 8 hours of sleep, but had in fact had 5 hours of sleep. They also found the EEG high alpha activity, which is that marker of the clock-driven drive to be awake that I mentioned, was greater when participants thought they'd had an 8-hour sleep opportunity, regardless of how long they actually slept. And so the implication of this is that if you perceive the amount of sleep you're getting as being inadequate, your brain will likely function worse than if you perceive it to be sufficient. So when you get less sleep than you would like, celebrate the fact that you at least got some sleep. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope it's been helpful, interesting, and well balanced. The next episode in this series is much more practical and is all about what you can do to get the right amount of sleep for you. Thanks very much for tuning in, and I hope you sleep well tonight.